Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Reverse English by Hugh MacNair. Detective Story Magazine, January 6, 1920. People that lunch at Gandil's, soliloquized Mr. Sigismund Klatsch, should name no names. He contemplated his thick veal chop with obvious affection and returned with gusto to his interrupted task of consuming it. He always lunched at Gandil's, chiefly because the food, considered in relation to the prices, was surprisingly abundant and good, but partly because the arrangement of the restaurant enabled a man with reasonably good ears to overhear occasional scraps of conversation which could be turned to good account. All along the three inner walls of the long, narrow room, the tables were arranged in little compartments, open only on the side toward the center of the café. This, Mr. Klatsch knew, enabled the thrifty Hans Gandil to economize remarkably on space. If the restaurateur arranges his tables in the usual fashion, he must allow space between them. Sufficient at least to leave room for chairs to be moved back and forth without interfering with each other. By setting his tables in these small compartments, Hans Gandil was able to persuade one patron to sit with his back against an inch-thick partition, against the opposite side of which another guest was seated. Besides, it saved steps for the waiters, who were expected to serve only from the outer side of their tables, instead of passing around each one of them after the common practice in eating places. And lastly, as Mr. Gandil had discovered, people who talk business over their meals like the privacy which is seemingly guaranteed by the enclosing backs of the benches. Mr. Klatsch, if he had business to discuss at meal times, carefully avoided Gandil's and selected a restaurant where he could inspect his neighbors. But when he lunched alone, he invariably occupied one of the three-sided cubicles and listened attentively to the unguarded conversation which drifted over the benches. More than once, he had been able to turn this feature of the place to profitable use. Today, however, the pleasure had been other than financial. He had listened with lively appreciation to a frank comment on his own character and habits, which, because of its strong disfavor, appealed to him as a compliment. He had identified the voice as that of young Mr. Goss, whose duty as the traveling salesman for Miller, Kuhn and Corporation, importing chemists, obliged him to pay semi-occasional visits to Mr. Klatsch's office. "I sure do hate a man who would be a crook if he dared, and skates as near the deadline as he can without stepping across it," declared Mr. Goss incautiously. "I run into that sort of businessman every now and then, and I always feel as if I ought to pack a gun and padlock my watch. I've got a customer right here in town who'd take pennies out of a blind man's cup if he was sure nobody was looking. He makes a patent medicine that costs him about $2 a barrel and sells it for $1 an ounce. That sort of a crab, you know. And he buys just about the way he sells. I caught him just in the act of slipping one over on the firm today." Mr. Goss's companion made some inaudible comment, and the aggrieved salesman, lifting his voice a little as the memory of his narrow escape rankled, related the details. "He buys his materials in small quantities, and you can't sell him an ounce unless you make it a bargain. I never go near him unless I've got a job lot of something to offer at a sacrifice. He uses some stuff that there's almost no call for over here. Kaolinite, we call it, and we import it, now and then, in small quantities, merely to have a full line. Today, the old skin wanted me to have the firm stock up heavily on it. Had a line of talk about being ready to expand his plant and wanting to tie up with a house which would carry a full stock of his ingredients. Kaolinite costs a good bit, and we can clean up a nice profit on it, even after dickering with Klatsch down to the last penny he can squeeze off our figures, so I was tickled. I'd have fallen hard for his play if I hadn't bumped into Phil Baker, who travels for Peabody and Blair. He tipped me off. It seems Clatch pulled the same stunt on them a couple of years back, got them to import a full ton of kaolinite with the same line of chatter, and then told them he'd take it off their hands at about half what it cost them. See his game? Mr. Clatch grinned. Having invented the game at some expense in mental effort, he was inclined to be proud of it. He nodded approvingly as he listened to the recital. Why, he knew perfectly well that nobody else in the country could use more than a few pounds of it, and that unless Peabody and Blair took his offer, they'd be carrying it till Judgment Day, with cost, freight, and a stiff duty tied up in it. That's why he doesn't import it himself, as he could easily enough. He'd rather let some simple sucker like me bring it in for him and lose money on it. A lad like old Sigismund Clatch is a whole lot worse than a yegg. There's no law to touch him. But I'm going to get square with him this time. Listen, he's counting on our firm to bring over the ton of kaolinite he talked about. He won't place an order with anybody else. I'm going to let him count on us till he gets up against it for his supply, and then I'll hand him the frozen laugh and tell him where he gets off. And I'll pass the word along the line to the other firms so that when he goes shopping for what there is in the market, they'll stick him till he bleeds. That's what he gets for trying to slip one over on yours truly. It was at this stage of the proceedings that Mr. Clatch made his remark concerning the inadvisability of mentioning names in public places. He had been counting on his supply of kaolinite at the expense of Miller, Kuhn, and Corporation, and if luck had not brought him to Gandil's today, the situation which young Mr. Goss expected might easily have come into being, but forewarned, with Mr. Clatch, was very much forearmed. He would arrange for all the kaolinite he needed easily enough, and in due time the laugh would be on Mr. Goss, as it usually was on those who fancied their wits superior to those of Sigismund Clatch. He waited patiently until Goss and his friend finished and departed. Then, scowling a little, he went back to his dingy office in the old brick rookery in which he manufactured his medicine. It was not an appealing location, although when the engravers had properly retouched its photograph, it made quite an imposing exhibit on Mr. Clatch's letterheads and literature. He had added several stories to its height in these depictions, had widened the alley on which it fronted to a tree-flanked boulevard, and had inserted the presentments of trolleys, motors, and pedestrians, which completed the effect of prosperity and solidity. There was no law against any of these expedients, or Mr. Clatch would not have indulged in them. He was one of the most law-abiding of men, a close and careful student of the statutes bearing on his business, and a persistent observer of their every letter. His remedy, which he advertised and sold exclusively in the poorer and less intelligent sections of the country, contained no ingredient which offended any law, local or national. His advertising, over which he spent many long hours of study, made no claims to which a prosecuting attorney could take exception. Every statement in it was either provably true or at least not provably false, although the impression gained by an average reader would contain many erroneous ideas as to the virtues of the preparation. Every testimonial Mr. Clatch published had been duly signed and sworn to by a real man or woman, and the portraits of these grateful patients were painstakingly accurate. Mr. Clatch took no chances. He made a considerable amount of money and took pleasure in accumulating it, though he spent very little of it. Money held immense significance for him. He disliked parting with it, even for things he desired. However, the thrill of amassing wealth was genuine, heightened by the fact that he earned it by skirting the fine line between legality and crime. Money acquired through straightforward, irreproachable means would not have brought him the same satisfaction. Now it annoyed him to realize that his little scheme to secure his next 3-year supply of kaolinite at the expense of Messrs. Miller, Kuhn, and Corporation had fallen through, yet he felt a strange delight in the good fortune that had warned him in time. It would be a hassle to set the trap again, and young Goss, who seemed to be a loose talker, might alert other chemical houses to his tactics. There was even a chance he would have to pay full market prices for this essential element, a prospect that distressed him merely to consider. He had always relished the process of obtaining kaolinite below market value. It catered to his instincts, as he was practically the only large user of the substance in the country. However, securing it at a significant discount required effort and careful planning. He couldn't simply approach a new importing firm and ask them to stock up on such a little used product without placing a definite order. Instead, he needed to buy steadily, in small quantities, for 6 months or a year to convince them he was a consistent buyer. This would increase the chances they might fall for the same trap that had ensnared Peabody and Blair and others before them. As Mr. Clatch pondered which importer to target from his list, a visitor walked into the office. He had no qualms about skipping a clerk to serve as a barrier between himself and unwelcome guests. He believed he was perfectly capable of protecting himself against time-wasting intruders, and his office door was always open to anyone willing to step through. The newcomer stood patiently until Mr. Clatch acknowledged his presence. He scowled ominously, demanding to know the purpose of the intruder's visit, a tone suggesting that unless justified, a violent ejection would follow. The visitor smiled cheerfully and handed Mr. Clatch a printed business card. The medicine maker glowered at it, reading, "John Duncan, importer of chemicals." Clatch glanced up, concealing a flicker of pleasure. A new importer? Perhaps here lay an opportunity. "Well, what do you want?" he demanded brusquely. "I'm not in the market for anything right now." The other shrugged. "Sorry. I thought you might be interested in some kaolinite I've picked up at a price that lets me offer it 10 cents off the market. But if you can't use it..." He turned to leave. Mr. Clatch stopped him. "Wait. I might be able to use a little if the quality's right. Did you bring a sample?" "No. I'm just starting out and my place is still chaotic. But I thought I'd drop in to see whether you could use this kaolinite. I haven't bought it yet. I took an option on it, hoping to sell it to you. If you're not interested, I'll let it go." Mr. Clatch considered swiftly. His guess had been right. This fellow was a beginner, who likely knew nothing of his reputation, if he played his cards carefully. "I could use £100 or so, if the quality's right, and you could deliver it at 15 cents off the market. Bring in a sample, and we'll talk." "All right, but 10 cents off is the best I can do. I'll be around tomorrow." Duncan left, leaving his card behind. The address revealed he had rented space in the Cosmopolitan building. Clatch filed it away and pushed the matter from his mind. The next afternoon, Duncan returned with a sample of the commodity, which Mr. Clatch recognized immediately as a better grade than he had been buying. They haggled industriously for half an hour, and Clatch ultimately signed an order for £50 at Duncan's price. 2 weeks later, the shipment arrived, accompanied by an invoice. True to his habit, Clatch paid promptly, taking advantage of the cash discount. He also placed another order with Duncan for a similar quantity at the same price, which was delivered and paid for as well. Duncan quoted him a slight discount on other chemicals, explaining he was trying to build his business by sacrificing a portion of his profits. Mr. Clatch encouraged this notion, allowing Duncan to believe that when his prices rose to market levels, he would retain Clatch's patronage. He also paid promptly on each invoice. Finally, Clatch felt the time was right to discuss the kaolinite importation. Duncan listened intently, clearly pleased. He promised to place orders immediately, putting him in a position to meet Clatch's needs. "It'll tie up a good chunk of my capital," he remarked. "But I assume you'll be buying it off my hands pretty quickly." "I'll probably buy it all at once," Clatch replied, truthfully enough. "You get it over here as soon as possible, and we'll do business." "I'll cable today," said Duncan, rising. Mr. Clatch, surveying the insurance calendar over his desk, grinned cheerfully. The more of Duncan's capital he tied up in the kaolinite importation, the cheaper that kaolinite would become for him. Duncan would find himself in a corner, with escape only at Clatch's discretion. Things couldn't have worked out better. Less than 3 weeks later, Duncan announced that the shipment had arrived, hinting broadly that he would like to transfer a portion of it to Clatch as soon as possible. Mr. Clatch confronted the situation directly. "Look here, Duncan. Suppose I don't buy any of that kaolinite. What would you do about it?" Duncan looked startled. "It would break me, I guess. I have thousands tied up in it with freight and duties. I need every nickel to keep the business running, but I'm not worried. If you told me to place the order, I know, but my plans have changed since then," Clatch replied, shaking his head. "It doesn't seem feasible for me to proceed with the big scheme for a while, maybe a year or two. And if I don't, I can't tie up my capital in that kaolinite." Duncan's expression shifted to one of concern. "Phew, that means I'll be in trouble then. I counted on you, Mr. Clatch. You told me definitively." "Show me the writing," Clatch interjected sharply. "Don't make any insinuations about not getting a square deal from me, Duncan. If you load it up with kaolinite on the chance of selling it to me, that's your business. I'm stocked up and out of the market right now. But nothing. If you stuck your head in a noose, that's your funeral, Duncan. I've got my own troubles. If you don't have anything else to offer—" "Oh, come on, make a bid on the stuff. You can afford to hold it, and I can't. It's tough, but I need the money. I'll give you all my profit and a slice of the cost too. I'll think it over. Maybe I might be interested." Clatch returned to his work, and Duncan, looking dejected, left the office. He called twice that afternoon and once more the next morning. On the final call, Clatch tired of the situation. "I'll give you 50% of the price for that kaolinite," he stated. "Take it or leave it. $14,000. Not a nickel more." He estimated that this was the minimum he could offer. If he went lower, Duncan might be tempted to deal with other importers who would certainly give him at least that much for his surplus. Duncan groaned and attempted to argue, but Clatch hung up the phone. As was his routine, he headed to the bank to deposit the day's checks. He wasn't surprised to see Duncan there. They had crossed paths in the bank lobby several times, and it was Clatch's suggestion that had led Duncan to open his account at the Fireman's National rather than at the Cosmopolitan Trust. The topic resurfaced as they stood before the teller. "Really, Mr. Clatch, you're pushing too hard. You'll break me if you stick to that offer." "Then don't take it, simple as that." Clatch turned to the teller, sliding his checks under the wicket. "If you break, it's on you. If you sell, you save half your loss. That's better than nothing." "Would you pay cash if I took you up on it?" Duncan clearly wavered. "Of course. I always do. But I take 2% extra naturally." They debated this detail for a moment, and then Duncan capitulated. "All right. You've got me. I'll deliver at your plant sometime this morning and take your price. But this is going to break me. You played me for a sucker, Clatch. You lured me into ordering that stuff just so you could beat me down on it. I see that now." Clatch grinned at the teller. "You're ahead of the game. If you learn to do business my way, it's worth a lot more than $14,000 to you. Next time, maybe you'll get a written contract. Bring me the stuff, and you'll get your check. Right, Paulson?" The teller, with his fixed, impersonal grin, nodded as he worked. Clatch took his passbook and left, feeling quite pleased. He wouldn't need to buy kaolinite again for 2 or 3 years, and he was stocking up at an incredible price. He returned to his office, awaiting news of Duncan's promised delivery. The morning dragged on without any sign of the kaolinite. Stepping out a little earlier than usual for lunch, Clatch made his way to the Cosmopolitan building and ascended to the 12th floor, where Duncan occupied a small, inexpensive office. The door was locked, and he hesitated with his hand on the knob, considering whether to leave a message through the letter slot, when a hall porter sauntered by. "You looking for Duncan? He's gone out of business. Moved his stuff this morning." Clatch suppressed a chuckle. The fact that Duncan had given up the fight after his encounter with the formidable Sigismund Clatch added to his satisfaction. He felt no pity for the man he had effectively ruined through legal means. In fact, knowing that Duncan was more seriously hurt than he had appeared only pleased Clatch further. He was about to leave when he spotted Duncan at the end of the corridor and called out to him. "Hey Duncan, why didn't you deliver that stuff this morning like you promised? I need to close the deal today or not at all." I'm sorting it out this afternoon," Duncan snapped. "Couldn't get the truckman this morning. I can't blame you for wanting to close a deal like that. It's almost robbery, Clatch." Clatch chuckled. All right. The winner takes his share, and the loser should take his licks too. But when you understand business, Duncan, you won't complain about being robbed. Admitting you've been robbed means admitting you deserved it. Any guy who can't hold on to his money should lose it in this world. Deliver this afternoon, and you'll get your check. 14,000 is better than nothing. You're getting off light, I tell you." Duncan turned away angrily, and after another chuckle, Clatch headed to Gandil's for lunch, enjoying it a bit more than usual. His enjoyment increased when he ran into young Goss at the restaurant. "Hello, Clatch," Goss said cheerfully. "I was coming in to see you this afternoon. Ready for that big shipment of kaolinite you wanted us to have on hand?" Clatch could have laughed in Goss's face. Did he think he was going to pull a fast one on him? Well, let him keep thinking so. With Duncan's kaolinite at hand, he would be independent of Goss and the others for years to come. "Pretty soon, I guess," he said. "Just let me know when you're ready to ship." Goss nodded. "All right. But give us as much notice as you can. We have another customer using quite a bit of it now, and we can't guarantee to hold it for you." Clatch nodded. Another customer. That seemed flimsy. No one in the country bought kaolinite in large quantities except Sigismund Clatch. Did Goss think he could be deceived by such a bluff? His skepticism showed on his face, and Goss read it, responding as if Clatch had voiced his doubts. "Don't believe it, huh? That's where you're mistaken. We've been selling a lot of it, right here in your own town lately. Wouldn't be surprised if someone else has gotten hold of that formula of yours and is starting to compete with you. Better keep your eyes open." Clatch could usually tell when someone was lying to him. He felt uncomfortably certain that Goss was telling the truth this time. The idea that someone else was buying kaolinite didn't sit well with him. It meant there would be competition for a trapped importer to offer his stock. It might even mean Duncan could wriggle out of his predicament. Returning to his office, Clatch felt increasingly anxious. His anxiety grew as the afternoon passed with no sign of Duncan or the kaolinite. He tried to locate Duncan but found no trace of him. That evening, convinced Duncan had learned about the rival buyer, he sought out Goss at the hotel, asking for the name of the customer who had purchased kaolinite. Goss hesitated to reveal it, clearly enjoying Clatch's distress. But Clatch had a knack for extracting information from people who intended to withhold it, and before Goss could censor an impulsive answer to a seemingly casual question, the name slipped out. Duncan. Clatch froze. "You mean Duncan in the Cosmopolitan building?" "I don't mean a thing, Clatch. You can't pump me. One customer's business doesn't belong to another. That's that." Clatch turned away, frowning harder than ever. If Duncan had purchased the kaolinite he sold to Clatch from Miller, Kuhn and Corporation, he had lost money on every pound. Why? What reason could there be for a man to make Sigismund Clatch such a gift? He worried over this all night and through the next day, with no sign from the absent Duncan. A week dragged by, and still Duncan failed to appear with his kaolinite. Clatch's supply was dwindling. forcing him to send out small orders to the firms he had previously dealt with, including Miller, Kuhn and Corporation. His peace of mind was further unsettled by the replies he received, each announcing a 10% increase on the last quotations. Clearly Goss had executed his plan to line up the importers against Klatch. When the first of the month arrived, bringing with it a statement from the Firemen's National, Klatch stared blankly at the buff sheet that revealed a balance entirely inconsistent with his own records. He rifled through the cancelled checks with trembling fingers. Suddenly, a shrill yelp of genuine anguish escaped him, prompting the shipping clerk in the adjacent room to poke his head through the door, half hoping someone had finally delivered the physical retribution that most of his employees dreamed of administering to Klatch. Mr. Klatch, clutching a cancelled check, was vigorously ringing the hook on his telephone, screaming a number into the mouthpiece. The shipping clerk, disappointed by the lack of violence, was about to close the door and return to work when the connection was made, and Klatch's voice, now a high-pitched shriek, rang out pathetically. "Say, you've got some nerve charging me $14,000 on a bad check. If you think I'll stand for this." The shipping clerk listened intently, regretting that he couldn't hear the bank's bookkeeper's response. If someone had managed to relieve Klatch of $14,000, it would hurt far more than any solid blow to his sensitive nose. "I tell you it's no good. A blatant forgery. I'll be right down there to prove it. Just wait and see." The clerk watched as Klatch seized his hat and bolted from the office. He returned to his work, feeling disheartened. Nobody could cheat old Sigismund Klatch out of a cent, he thought gloomily. But he would have felt better had he been able to accompany his boss to the Firemen's National, where a suave and courteous cashier examined Exhibit A in Klatch's case against the bank. "It's your check, isn't it?" The cashier scrutinized the pink slip. "It bears your regular imprint, and the signature is unmistakably yours. But we'll ask Paulson about that." He pressed a button, and when the teller arrived, he showed him the evidence. "It's Mr. Klatch's signature, all right," Paulson stated bluntly. "There won't be any trouble proving that. It's his check, too, bearing the correct consecutive number. I don't know what he's trying to pull, but the check is valid. I overheard him discussing the deal with Mr. Duncan just a day or so before the check arrived." A cold realization coursed through Klatch. He had brought his checkbook and, in sudden panic, fumbled through the stubs. A cry of understanding escaped him. "Here it is. He took a check for $14 I sent him for goods he delivered, and raised it to $14,000. Look, here's the stub, the number matches and the date. This is how he did it." "That's probably it," Paulson said, narrowing his eyes as he scrutinized the paper. "Yes, it's been altered. I see that now. But it's a clever job, a mighty clever bit of work. Too bad, Mr. Klatch. $14,000 could buy quite a few first-class check-protecting machines." He shrugged. "I've told you several times that you were taking a long chance not to use one." Klatch, vastly relieved, chuckled cheerfully. "I shouldn't worry about that, Paulson. You admit you paid the money on a bad check. The bank could probably absorb the loss, but," the teller interjected smoothly, "you're laboring under a common misconception, Mr. Klatch. The bank would be responsible if your signature had been forged. As it stands, your signature is legitimate. Your account was substantial enough to cover the amount. When you consult a lawyer, you'll find that the loss is yours. Isn't that so, Mr. Brownlee?" Brownlee nodded. "Yes, it's your loss, Mr. Klatch. I'm very sorry, but there's nothing we can do about it. Of course, if you wish, you can sue us, but any lawyer will tell you we're not liable because you left enough space after 14 on your check for anyone to fill in a larger amount." Mr. Klatch left, blustering but gradually realizing that the bank knew what it was talking about. A conversation with his attorney confirmed this notion. He ultimately decided to turn the case over to the police. who are still attempting to locate Mr. John Duncan of the Cosmopolitan building. As for Mr. Duncan, who contemplated a profit of over $13,000 from his 3-month stint as a salesman, he shared his thoughts with his friend Barney Sims. "The whole trick in this check-hoisting play," Duncan confided, "is to pick out a sucker who thinks he's wise. This guy Clatch was trying to skin me from the start, making him an easy target. The key point in my game is to bypass the honest lads and look for a crook. The moment I identify someone treating business like a shell game, my job is nearly done." I was in a restaurant when I overheard someone mention a slick trick Clatch had tried to pull. That was all I needed. The rest was a cakewalk. $13,200 for 3 months easy work is more than good enough for me. If there were more guys like Clatch in business, I'd be a billionaire, Barney. End of Reverse English by Hugh MacNair.